long, long time ago, in a studio up at Elstree, this chap had a lot of fun making a TV series about a fellow called Simon Templar. He got to play at being a roaring adventurer who loves a fight, a dashing daredevil, imperturbable, debonair, preposterously handsome, and, of course, rescue lots of damsels in distress. This TV series, complete with those lovely damsels, ran for 7 years and sold around the world. But by the late 1960s, both the show's star and crew decided it was time to move on and do something else. However, interest in the Saint's adventures carried on with novelizations of the TV series selling well and comic strips and other merchandise propelling the Saint into the 1970s. Indeed, by the early part of the decade, with repeats of the TV series still running around the world, the show's producer, Robert S. Baker, began to wonder if, at least as far as television went, it was time for some new Saint adventures. You could almost say it was time for the return of the Saint. In fact, the story of Return of the Saint starts with classic 1970s TV drama Upstairs, Downstairs. For 5 episodes in 1972, featured a young and upcoming actor by the name of Ian Ogilvy.
Bob Baker saw me in Upstairs, Downstairs, which was a long time before we ever started The Saint, and apparently said to his wife, if we ever make The Saint again, that would be a good chap for it. And indeed, shortly after that, I had lunch with him, and he told me about his interest and said, would you be interested? And I said, sure.
About 10 years after we shot The Saint, I had a meeting with Lou Grade. I think it was Sir Lou Grade at the time, or Lord Grade, I can't remember. And I said, Lou, you know, I think that Return of the Saint would be a very good idea. Lou said, well, fine. I says, who's going to play the Saint? Who's going to play Roger's part? I said, well, I've seen an actor in a couple of films, and I've watched his work. He's very good looking. He's a good actor. His name is Ian Ogilvy. So he said, well, I'll tell you what. He says, why don't you shoot a test on Ian Ogilvy, and we'll do a Saint scene. He says, and we'll have a look at it.
We had a producer who so knew what he was doing. I mean, he'd done it before with Roger for years. He'd done other series. He knew exactly how this kind of stuff worked. And we should all have bowed down to Bob Baker because he knew what he really knew his onions, that guy.
We phoned in. I got him down to the studio. I got a scene ready from one of the old Saints. I brought in an actress to play opposite him, and we did a scene. And he was perfect. I took the show to Lou. Lou says, yes, it's great. He's going to be the Saint. He took the scene that we shot over to America the next week. He was going over there for a meeting with ABC Television, showed them the scene, and got the deal on Return of the Saint, just like that. So he came back and says, right, we've got a deal. We're making 24 episodes. Get the show together.
With Lord Grade backing the show, young Ian Ogilvy was quickly confirmed as the new Saint, though for just a minute it looked like he might be playing the son of the original Saint. For film and TV trade paper Variety reported in June 1976 that ITC is planning a second-generation sequel called son of the saint. The only hitch at the moment is that author Leslie Charteris, who created the character and who doesn't need the money, has yet to flash a green light for the project. As presently envisaged, the new format would have a grey-haired Moor in a Stetson, opening and introducing his offspring, then begging off.
It was very quickly discussed and rejected simply because I was too old and Roger was too young for that. And also, I think it was borne in on people's ideas that it was a perfectly self-contained series. You could simply make Return of the Saint. People had played... I mean, Roger was not the first to play the saint. There were many saints before him, including George Sanders and even Vincent Price.
Common sense prevailed, and soon Bob Baker started hiring his crew.
The next thing we had to do was get a story editor to begin to collect the scripts, and Harry Junkin, who did the original Saints, wasn't available, so we decided that we would get an American story editor. So I flew across to Los Angeles and met with a few writers. One was a man named Peter Allen Fields, who initially came over and agreed to be story editor, which he did do. We started writing the scenes, but after a little while he felt he didn't want to stay in England, he wanted to go back to America. So in the middle of shooting some of the original episodes of, the first episodes of Return of the Saint, I had to bring in the producers to stand in for me. And I had to fly back to Los Angeles and interviewed a few writers. And I met a writer named Tony Spinner, but he was not prepared to be just a story editor, he wanted to be producer as well. So I moved up to executive producer. He took over the job as producer, although in point of fact, really, he was just a story editor.
Tony was an American, came out of sort of commercial television in Los Angeles, and had that kind of take on things, and was a kind of logic fanatic, and a really, really, really interesting man to work with. Relentless, absolutely relentless.
The one thing he did do was he tried to stifle as much of the violence as possible in the shows, partly because at the time America was going through a terribly puritanical television bit where violence was very much tamped down. So all our fight scenes, or nearly all our fight scenes in The Saint, involved a baddie the size of a London bus coming at me, and I'd go, "Dum," and he'd fall over, which I always thought was a bit silly, because I'm not a big man, and I was always rather slight in those days. But that was one of his influences, which I thought was a mistake. But then, on the other hand, he might have been right about selling to America.
But he was particularly clever at the job. He was quite brilliant at the job. And from that point onwards, we had no script problems. We went right through the series. He would rewrite any scripts that came in he thought were not up to par. And we shot 9 episodes in Italy. He moved out there with us as a producer and a story editor, and things went remarkably smoothly as far as scripts are concerned.
Other crew members hired included many who had worked on the previous series of The Saint. Malcolm Christopher was production supervisor.
Great opportunity. It was like a roadshow.
To help write for The Saint, Baker turned one of Charteris's favourite scriptwriters and a frequent contributor to the previous TV series, John Cruise. Other writers were established scribes such as Michael Pertwee and a young scriptwriter called John Goldsmith.
I think it was through Jerry Anderson. The first script I ever sold for television was to Jerry Anderson for a show called The Protectors. Nari Dawn Porter and Robert Vaughan. Top-notch casting in those days, which is a rare animal now. It was a half-hour action-adventure of a sort of international kind. It was trying to compete with America. And I did, I think, 2 of those. And when they started the new series of The Saint, Bob was looking for writers, bumped into Jerry in the corridor. That's how it worked in those days.
One member of the crew, however, got the job through a family connection.
Simon Cowell's my wife's cousin, and he was. We had a wedding reception at his father's house in Elstree, which is a fabulous house. And there were his brother here, and Simon and Nicholas were a couple of little rascals. And it came one school holidays, and Eric wanted me to give Simon a job as just for the school holidays, and I gave him a job for 8 weeks.
One of the earliest decisions regarding the show was to send The Saint out on location rather than make use of the back lot at Elstree, which had been used to very good effect in the previous series.
And we started off in the south of France, came back to England to shoot finish the shows off in England, and then we went on to Italy to shoot 9 episodes around Italy, going from Cortina in the north, the Cinque Torre, down to Florence, Porto Ercole, Montalcino, Florence at San Gimignano, then to Rome, where we shot about 4 episodes in Rome, in and around Rome, and then going on to Latina, which is south of Rome. And we were quite a small unit. We were about 14 UK people. And Bob allowed me a pretty free hand. I got 4 little vans, a little 1-tonner and 3 minibuses. And we took all our props and clothes with us. Well, 1 caravanette for Ian as his own personal caravanette. And we just moved from one show to another show. With very little preparation. I think we started off in Cortina. We had about a week's preparation in Cortina. I had been to these locations beforehand, so when we took photographs back so the writers could write about the places we had, and so then we would always be a couple of weeks ahead. But we always had to have a plan B, because if something went wrong, like it snowed or didn't snow or whatever, we could go on to plan B. But it worked very well.
I think what was lovely was doing the foreign locations. I mean, they cost a fortune, and I think the show would have been just as successful without them, but I do think it gave an added little gloss to it, which it didn't have otherwise.
We were staying in the Val d'Or in Sir John Cap Ferrat. It was a lovely hotel, very quiet, by the side of a marina of various boats. And we were all sitting in the bar. That was Ian Ogilvy, myself, my wife, and Leslie Charteris having a drink before dinner. And who should barge in but Oliver Reed. Now, Oliver Reed had worked for me on a couple of episodes of The Old Saint. So he turned around and said, "Oh, Bob, what are you doing here?" I said, "Oh, here we're making Return of the Saint." He said, "Are you really?" He was a little bit worse for wear at the time, but he was articulate. I says, and this is Ian Ogilvy, the new saint. He says, "What, him?" So I said, "Yes." So he says, and I said, "This is Leslie Charteris, the author of the saint." So he turned around and looked. He said, "Are you really Leslie Charteris?" So Leslie says, "Yes." He says, "I've always wondered, admired your books so much." And Leslie said, "That's very, very nice of you." He says, "We're going to seal our friendship." So I looked at him, and Leslie looked at him, and Ian looked at him, and said, "Well, fine, what are you going to do?" So he went over to the bar. The barman had, at that particular point, disappeared. He produced a bar knife. He cut his wrist slightly, drawing blood, and he went across to Leslie. He says, "We're going to become blood brothers. Give me your wrist." So Leslie nearly went white, and he sat on his hands and wouldn't move. And eventually persuaded our friend to back off, and we were blood brothers without actually exchanging blood. So that was Ollie Reed. But you can never rely on when you were with Oliver Reed, anything could happen, anytime, any place, and usually did.
To help differentiate the show as well as bring it into the 70s, the decision was taken not to have the saint talk directly to the audience at the start of every episode, but to have a straightforward voiceover.
When I knew I was going to do Return of the Saint, I had to do things that are different to the Old Saint. The first thing was the presentation of the show. In the Old Saint, Roger would talk to camera, make an association between him and the audience straight away. But in this case, we decided not to have Ian talk directly to camera, but to talk over camera, which is much the same thing. We wanted to take the show a little bit out of true reality and give it a little fairy story background, as if the saint relating his adventures to a certain extent. So that was the first thing we did.
The voiceovers we did at the beginning were always done individually. I literally would be taken aside at the end of a day, or maybe at lunchtime. "Oh, quickly, could you just come over here and we'll do the voiceover?" And I would simply just stand there and read it.
Dallas, 1963. Memphis, 1968. The crack of the assassin's gun. The panic, the confusion. It's all there, stark and real, on the television screen. And for a moment you feel involved, but only for a moment. Well, this time I am involved. How or why, I don't know yet. Maybe I'm just about to find out. Jim.
Did you see it?
It was a miracle Kamal survived.
He'll need more than a miracle next time.
10 years had passed since The Last Saint, and the saint was pretty vivid in everyone's imagination, Roger Moore. So Ian had a difficult job to do to follow in Roger's shoes, same as Roger had a difficult job to do in following Sean Connery's shoes in Bonds.
You've just taken the J out of joy.
The saint doesn't have a character. The saint is what you make him. Like all heroes, action heroes specifically, James Bond, the saint, and even, for instance, lots of Dickens characters, the leading men, if you read them carefully, they are almost entirely without character. All right, you could say that the saint was debonair, and he was suave, and he had a twinkly smile, and he was nice to girls. That's not character, is it? So every actor who plays the saint essentially plays himself. And the reason you get cast is because your character, or the sort of person you are, fits that character. It's not really an acting job, it's more a sort of personality job.
And the saint had to have a car. Having seen how well Volvo did from the previous series, Jaguar, only too keen to correct their mistake, and offered the producers use of a Jaguar XJS.
Well, I remember back when we did the Roger Moore series, we wanted to have a very distinctive car. So we thought that the Jaguar sports car, the E-Type, was just coming out at that particular moment. It was very, very with-it car. So we phoned Jaguar and said, oh, we'd like a car, an E-Type, for a television series we're doing called The Saint. I said, we're not asking you to give us a car, we'll gladly buy a car, but we want the car immediately for the saint. The man on the other end, who was in the publicity department, says, well, quite frankly, we're not particularly, you have to wait for a car. As if the owner of Jaguar, Lord, whatever his name was, wanted a car, he'd have to wait with everybody else. So I'm afraid it will be about 6 months before we can promise you a car. So to forget it. We then approached Volvo, who had a new sports car that just come over to England. When we asked them to supply us a car, they said, oh, great, fine, yes, you can have one. What colour would you like? When would you like it? We said we'd like a white one, and we'd like it now. Right, within a day, we had a P1800 Volvo. Not only did we have a P1800 Volvo, they sent us the bodywork so that we could shoot interiors in the studio without having to use the actual car. Then again, they supplied a second car, which we could use for second unit. So one car we could use for main unit, one car for the second unit, so it worked out fine. When it came to do Return of the Saint, we thought, well, we'll phone Jaguar. We wanted a British car. Well, of course, Jaguar couldn't fall over themselves quick enough to supply us a car. Not only did they supply us a car, they supplied us a car anywhere in the world with a driver to maintain it and look after it and make sure it was mechanically perfect. So indeed, we used a Jaguar and had no problems with it. It was fine.
And we had two Jaguars, one automatic and one manual. One had a sunroof. I've been looking at the episodes to see which one was in which. But they're basically the same sort of car, but we kept a manual one for staying in one gear if we wanted to or whatever, and the sunroof was great so the cameraman could light through the roof if necessary. They weren't the most reliable car in the world because they were early production models, but they were good-looking cars.
Guest stars included Sam Wanamaker, Stratford Johns, Britt Ekland, Linda Thorson, Mary Tam, and Jenny Hanley.
It's Robbie.
What happened to you?
Your father says Jane's dead.
Yes, Robbie, she is.
I remember one of the guest actors we had was Sam Wanamaker, the American actor who'd made his home in England. And Sam was so beloved by us all and so good, and we also knew he was a director, that Bob Baker asked him to come and direct a couple of episodes as well. So having been a guest actor in it, he then went on and directed a couple.
And in an uncredited walkthrough in the two-part story Collision Course was the Saint's creator himself, Leslie Charteris. Look carefully at the background of this scene.
I believe your story, madame.
Thank heaven for that.
The radiator hose was found to be cut. We have replaced it. Now, if you excuse me, Madame West, do you recognize any of these men?
Yes. That's Bonaparte, the man who moved in on my husband.
And together with her husband, the five of them stole a shipment of gold bullion passing between France and French Morocco. Worth about, $15 million, if I'm not mistaken.
I can't believe it.
We were filming Collision Course. In fact, actually, the title we used was The Saint and the Brave Goose. Collision Course was the original script title, but before it became a Saint project, which was a particularly good episode. It was a double episode. In fact, it was a feature-length film. And I remember I had a meeting with Leslie, and he was having his house redecorated. Audrey said to me, "Bob, do me a favour, will you?" I said, "Sure." Well, she said, "I'm going to have the house redecorated. I don't want Leslie anywhere around. So would you invite him to go on location with you and for a couple of weeks so that I can get the kitchen and everything sorted out whilst he's away?" So I said, "Sure, I'd be delighted to have Leslie." So we invited Leslie as a guest of the production, and we stayed at a hotel in St Jean Cap Ferrat called the Val d'Or, I think it was. And Leslie always used to go there for his holidays. So he, in point of fact, he kept his clothes at the Val d'Or and would not have to take any clothes with him when he went on the holiday. So we were staying at the Val d'Or, and Leslie joined us there. And whilst he used to come on location with us just to see the shooting. And we were doing a scene where we needed some crowd in the background. So I said, "Leslie, would you like to be in one of the scenes?" He said, "Oh, yeah, could I?" I says, "Yes, well, we're not using normal crowd here. We're just picking up people we can find to use for background stuff." So Leslie appeared in the scene in Collision Course, walking in the background whilst the two actors were talking in the foreground. So that was Leslie's debut. In point of fact, I think he wrote it in the Saint magazine that he actually appeared in one of the Saint episodes and challenged any viewer to see if they could pick him out.
Having read the script for Appointment in Florence, Charteris expressed his concern in a memo to producer Bob Baker. "No complaint about this as a story, but it does add yet another to the lengthening list of spaghetti saints." Baker responded by explaining the situation. "We are getting a lot of spaghetti saints, and indeed will be getting more, as the 9 episodes we are shooting in Italy are a co-production deal with Rai Television, and part of the agreement is that the films all have Italian backgrounds, or at least part Italian backgrounds, and that we should also employ Italian artists and crew. In terms of physical production, this operation is not easy, as we find problems mounting day by day. The Italians are not used to shooting at the speed of a television series, and do not seem to be very adept at improvisation and sudden changes of plans. However, it is an experience that I am not likely to forget."
So we went over and had a series of meetings with Rai, and I began to discover that the Rai didn't want to use any British technicians at all. They wanted the entire show to be taken over, produced by and run by Italians. I objected to this. We had a big stand-up fight. And I phoned up Lou and said, "Lou, we can't get on with the Rai. Rai want that their demands are impossible. We really can't do the show. Can't have control of the show. So Louis says, well, then let's do the show without Rye, so I'll put up the rest of the money. So we gave Rye the elbow, and we took over the show ourselves.
Charteris's agreement with the producers allowed him to see and comment on each script before they started production.
He was always extremely nice and kind to me, very, very supportive, always asking if there was anything he could do to help, by which he meant, if there's something about these scripts which you don't like, let me help. You don't have to be the bad guy, I can be the bad guy.
He was kinder. His memos were much not so vicious as his original memos on the Saints stories, because he didn't invent the stories. They were someone else's things.
With some stories, though, more work was required, and Charteris was quick to spot it. For the Murder Cartel, which was ultimately credited to John Goldsmith from a story by Maurice Farry and John Cruise, he commented that, "From the credits, this seems to have been written by committee. For 3/4 of the way, it is immensely better than most scripts have been for some time. Then suddenly, whoever came in or dropped out, it falls apart. As for scene 84 on page 48, this is surely the most inept station break. The cliffhanger should obviously be when the saint is cliffhanging."
Well, the rewrites, of course, had to be done with incredible urgency, and they were real sort of towel-on-the-head jobs. Murder Cartel, I think, took something like, I think it was about 10 days, and I played the most awful trick on Bob. It was desperately urgent. I mean, they commissioned a script which hadn't worked out, as they often don't. I mean, I've written scripts that don't work out, been rewritten by other writers. It's part of the game. And I knew they wanted it terribly urgently. And in those days, of course, there wasn't even a fax, let alone email. Everything had to be couriered. A chap would arrive in a sort of leathers and a helmet, and take away the physical script and get it on a plane and take it out to Rome, where they were based. And I knew this. So I wrote a spoof first page. Now, one of the briefs we'd all been given was to try and get more humour into these shows. And I think one of the problems with the original script of Murder Cartel was that the interpretation of humour had gone a bit agley, and there was some slapstick and stuff which had horrified everybody. So I wrote this spoof first page. It had one of the great openings of all time. It was St. Peter's Square. The saint and his CIA friend are cycling across St. Peter's Square on a tandem. And the camera pans up to the great balcony where the Pope delivers his Sunday message. And there's the Pope, who says, "Now there's a guy I'd like to make a saint." You then cut to a kitchen where the saint and his CIA pal are discussing the plot that actually is the plot of the episode about this murder cartel organization. And they start quarreling. And the CIA guy picks up a pie and slaps it into the saint's face, and then the saint picks up another pie. So it becomes literally a slapstick comedy sequence, right? And I put that as the first page. Now, Bob and Tony were sitting, Tony told me the story, they had shared a huge office overlooking the Forum in Rome. So the script arrives, right? It's copied and delivered. And they both sit down. Well, this is really urgent. I mean, they're shooting on Monday. They sit down. Bob starts reading this. Goes pale beneath his tan, looks up and says to Tony, "John's gone mad. He's gone completely mad." Now, Tony had twigged that it was a spoof. And he said, "No, I think it's great, Bob. I mean, what a wonderful opening. St. Peter's Square, the Pope is wonderful. And then, I think this next scene in the kitchen is really funny. Bob..." And then finally, Bob twigged it, turned over the page, and there was the real opening. I don't think he's ever quite forgiven me.
A lot of the scripts I thought were a little banal and a little cliched, and I would quietly in my room at night go over the next day's scene, and I'd just tinker with it. I would always keep the speeches the same length, and I would always keep the cue for the actor to whom I'm speaking would be the same. But within the speech, I would try and make it my own. And the next day I'd go to the actor and I'd say, "Look, this is what I've done." Or even the night before, I'd say, "I'm going to play with it a bit, but this is what I do. Please feel free as well." And nobody ever commented on it, and nobody ever objected to it particularly. And I remember there was one funny occasion when a new director called Les Norman was going to come and direct some episodes, and Les had had a laryngectomy, which is, the operation to remove the whole larynx, and he did this esophageal speech, which is you do on the belch. It sounds really strange, but that's how he did it. And he'd retired. And Bob Baker, who was always very fond of Les Norman, said to him, come on, come out and do some Saints. And Les said, I can't. Bob said, yes, you can. I'll give you a really noisy first assistant director who'll do all your shouting for you, but come and direct some Les. So Les came out, and the crew had all worked with Les for years before. They all warned me about him. They said, he's a terrible tyrant. He's a martinet. He's the cruelest. He's a wonderful director, but he's a toughie, and he'll be horrible. So I got this new script, and I was reading it, and I found this particular scene, which I thought was just awful. So I extensively rewrote this one. And the next morning I went in, and I met Les for the first time. And I said to him, by the way, this scene we're going to shoot, Les, I've rewritten it. He, what? And I said, I've rewritten it. He said, why? I said, because it was horrible. It was dreadful. It was unspeakable. He said, I wrote it. So I said, I can't take any of it back, can I? I still think it's a horrible scene, but I apologize. Well, what do you want to say? So I showed him my script, and he said, that's crap. I said, I think we're beginning to understand each other, aren't we? You've written crap, and I've written crap. So maybe there's something in between, right? And we got on very, very well after that. I don't want to do lots of Les Norman stories. He had two girls that all they had to do was ride in the park. And they were like extras. But he had needed a couple of riders, these pretty girls, and they came with all their gear. And I heard him say, right, you can ride. And they went, yes. He said, right, can you post? And they went, sorry, what? He said, can you post? And they went, I don't know what post is. Right, you can't bloody ride, fuck off. I went down, I said, excuse me, Les, wait. I said, Les, I've written since I was 8 years old. I don't know what posting is. He was, when you do that to the trot. I said, oh, you mean rise to the trot. Ladies, can you rise to the trot? They went, yes, of course. I said, come on. And he hired them.
But with the poppy chain, Charteris was back protesting the lack of originality. Too bad this doesn't have a more original or offbeat theme, but it's handled with all the typical crew's competence. And the village that sold its soul also seemed somewhat formulaic. Most of the developments in this exercise in Italian Gothic are fairly predictable once the stage has been set. The adventure for the saints starts with the usual fantastic fluke, which has just become part of the format.
Well, when I was first approached, they explained that they were going to shoot a lot in Italy, so they wanted Italian stories. So I thought up this idea for a story set in a kind of primitive village in Italy. And they loved it, and I wrote the first draft, and it was very much the story I pitched them, and they'd accepted. And it didn't work. We couldn't work out why. It just wasn't working. And we spent at least 2 days battling away with this story, which they really liked, and yet they knew, Bob and Tony Spinner I'm talking about here, and then Tony, and he was the first one who ever told me this, and it's a great principle for a writer, try turning it upside down. So we tried turning it upside down, and in my original draft, and I'll try and get this right, the saint arrives in this village, okay, and he's seen something odd. A woman's been killed, and because he's a saint, he decides to investigate. And in the original version, I had the village trying to confine the saint to the village. And when we turned it upside down, and we had the village trying to get rid of the saint, there's nowhere to stay, frighten him off with a cart that rolls down the thing. And the saint says, you know, the more they try and get rid of me, the more I'm inclined to stay. It suddenly was saint-like, and the whole thing worked. And I could rewrite it in a day and a half or something. I rewrote the whole thing. Basic story exactly the same, just that core motivation at the beginning different, and it worked.
The episode I like the most is one called Duel in Venice. First of all, it was shot in Venice, which is probably the most photogenic city in the world. Secondly, I think it had a rather good script and a good storyline. It was very exciting. Thirdly, I actually got wet in it, so I didn't have to run around with my hair perfectly permed and done all the time. I actually managed to look a bit scruffy in parts of that, which I liked. And thirdly, we had a wonderful leading lady, this French-Italian actress, whose name escapes me, but she was wonderful in it. She was funny. She played the little taxi driver, the little vaporetto driver of the boat, and she was great. And I just think it's easily the best episode of that show. There was one episode where I got a script about 2 or 3 weeks early, and I thought it was just a disaster. It was all about vampires, which I didn't think the Saint was anything to do with vampires. We didn't do supernatural stuff in the Saint.
Charteris had seen the initial script for the vampire episode, entitled Prince of Darkness, and credited to Stephen Candle. He wasn't keen. I would frankly hate to have to guess whether the Saint audience would accept the supernatural basis of this obvious attempt to leap on the bandwagon of so many recently successful films with this theme. On a point of mundane realism, I suggest that whenever it is possible, and the meaning should be obvious to most viewers, the dialogue on page 44 and thereafter should be conducted in Italian, since Italians do not talk amongst themselves in English with Italian accents. It's all good goulash for those who like the dish, but I still wish more of our scripts could be innovative instead of so blatantly imitative.
I was a little dubious about the whole thing anyway, but nevertheless he went ahead and rewrote the script, and it was a good script, there's no question about it, but it wasn't the Saint. It was the wrong sort of story for the Saint. It was the wrong image for the Saint. And it was basically a horror story, as you would expect for the Prince of Darkness.
And I didn't know what to do about it. And Leslie Charteris had always been my ally. Leslie Charteris, the original author of the Saint. And he'd always been an ally of mine and always, wanted to help and things. And he always had script approval. So I called him and I said, "Have you seen this script?" And he said, "I was wondering when you were going to call. Why didn't you call about any of the others?" And I said, "Well, I didn't think they were so bad." He went, "Oh, come on, they were all terrible." Anyway, this one, he said, "No, this one does not get passed. I will not let this go through." And he said, "And I'll keep you out of it completely. But you're absolutely right, this will not go through." And it was never shot, this episode.
The show debuted on Sunday, September the 10th, 1978, in a prime-time evening slot on the ITV network. But the critics weren't kind, with the Times calling it unintentionally comical. However, St. Ian Ogilvy went on to win the TV Times Award for the most compulsive character, so they were obviously doing something right.
Well, the press reaction in terms of publicity was fine. The critics were a nightmare, of course, but they did make me laugh. I mean, they were criticizing this show as though it was I, Claudius, in a sense. I mean, The Saint is designed for people who've had a long, hard day in the factory and come home, they sit down with a beer or a gin and tonic, and they want to see a pretty girl, a fast car, and a guy hitting people. That's what they want. This is not Hamlet we were making. So the critics on the whole were reasonably kind to me, but not terribly kind to the show. And I think, to be honest, Bob Baker and all of us sort of expected that. It was just an adventure show. I mean, I used to call it moving wallpaper, and I think it's a bit more than that. But at the same time, let's not oversell it. It wasn't anything more than a fun adventure action show. And nobody was going to say it was Hamlet or that the scripts were wonderful. They weren't. It was just a rollicking show, that's all.
It met the same fate as the original Saint in America. When we took the original Saint to America, it was rejected by all the networks. When we took this show to America, the networks already bought it, ABC. They put it into bad time slot, as they did with most British shows, and it didn't do any particular ratings.
You didn't have to ask too many questions about why. I mean, who does he work for? How does he get his money? Oh, who cares? Go on, drive the car.
Ian had taken over a role that the public had become so familiar with Roger. So it was always going to be difficult for him to get the same reaction as Roger got. And by the same token, Roger first Bond film was initially received fairly coolly because they had Sean Connery so vividly in mind of James Bond as a James Bond that it took Roger 2 or 3 shows to really get into the part. Now, at this particular time, we could do with another series of Return of the Saint, which would, I think, established Ian and would have gotten rid of the hangover of Roger's image.
Toward the end of the show's run, it became obvious that there would be no more adventures for the 1970s Saint. The show was expensive, and Lord Grade had other plans. He wanted to focus on film and, in particular, raise the Titanic.
General, it's over. The war's finished. You've won.
Lou Grade was, by virtue of his age, was forced to retire from ITC and no longer become involved in television series. So with Lou gone, there was no one there that was willing to continue with the Saint. In fact, the whole ITC system more or less packed up.
It came as a shock to everybody that we weren't going to go anymore, because it would have been a huge hit. We'd sold in 73 countries all over the world. And the next time round, we weren't going to go abroad. We were going to stay in Ealing or Southall, because we didn't need to go abroad. We'd got our audience. We'd established that we were glamorous and cars. And
Lou devoted what time he had with the company to producing feature films, and 1 or 2 were successful, but some were not. Raise the Titanic, as Lewis says, it had been cheaper to raise the Atlantic Ocean than to raise the Titanic, which was basically a flop.
There didn't seem to be any financial reason to cancel it, and that's the main reason why these things get stopped.
When Lou retired from television retired in that particular vein of thing. The entertainment action Avengers series was no longer made, and the studios made all sorts of things, but no action Avenger.
I'm sorry, Moreno. I'd love to have stayed, but... Now shut that for me, would you?
As far as quality of a show is concerned, it's much superior to the original Saint series. It really is. I must say, I'm quite proud of the quality of the show. It's really very good.
I don't know what it is about the show. I think it was cheerful. I think it was quite fun. I think it looked lovely. I think we had pretty girls. I think we had nice cars. We had effective bad guys. I just think it was a good show for its time, and people remember it.
So that was that. The Saint had returned. For a short while, anyway. The show was rerun across the ITV network just over a year later, and has been repeated periodically ever since. It sold around the world, taking the Saint's adventures from the 70s into the 80s, where, by the middle of the decade, Bob Baker thought the TV schedules were in need of a modern-day Robin Hood, so teamed up with producer D.L. Tafner, and that, as they say, is another story.